Tonight, from luxury to lockup, Sean Diddy Combs is on trafficking. We know the government's case is sensational, but is it strong? I'm Elizabeth Vargas, and America's News starts right now.
Tonight, what makes a multimillionaire music mogul nervous? How about the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison? The trial of Sean Diddy Combs begins today with jury selection, how the alleged sex trafficker is handling the pressure, and what prompted the dismissal of some potential jurors. Then stress, depression, isolation. 5 years later, America's kids are still suffering from COVID-19's school closures. Who's to blame, and could it have been avoided? Plus, President Trump wants to reopen one of America's most notorious prisons, Alcatraz. We know it would be expensive, but would it be worth it?
Our country needs law and order. Alcatraz is, I would say, the ultimate.
A historian who lived there as a child joins us live.
Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. Great to have you with us. We begin tonight in New York City, where the Met Gala is underway. It's traditionally where the fashion and Hollywood elite show off their extravagant style. And under normal circumstances, Sean Diddy Combs would probably be there, dressed to the nines, soaking up the spotlight on the red carpet, just like he did 2 years ago. But instead, the bad boy's CEO had another engagement, soaking up the fluorescent lights of a federal courtroom as jury selection in his sex trafficking trial began today. The hip-hop and fashion mogul arrived modestly dressed in a navy sweater over a white button-down shirt. His signature jet black hair is now gray because you can't use hair dye in the Brooklyn prison where Combs has been aging over the past 8 months. How the mighty have fallen. A jury of Combs's peers, 12 New Yorkers, will decide whether he's guilty of running a criminal organization that involved rape, drugs, and sexual exploitation. But finding impartial New Yorkers who don't already have an opinion about Combs or his highly publicized federal case could be a significant challenge. Combs has pleaded not guilty to 5 criminal counts of racketeering, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution. The 55-year-old music mogul rejected a plea deal that could have spared him longer prison time. Now, if he's convicted, he could be facing life staring at concrete walls. The gravity of his situation doesn't appear lost on Combs. As potential jurors were dismissed today, Combs reportedly asked the judge for a bathroom break, admitting, quote, he was a little nervous. Let's go right now to NewsNation's Caitlin Becker, live for us outside the courthouse in Lower Manhattan. Caitlin, what happened today? How far along are they in this jury selection process?
Well, Elizabeth, they're doing it a little bit differently than how you or I traditionally think about jury selection, where they pick a person, and if they are good with both sides, they get impaneled on that jury. What they're doing here is they're whittling down the larger jury pool to about 45. They're hoping to do that by Wednesday. And of that 45 number of acceptable jurors, they will then pick their 12 jurors and then 6 alternates. So today we have about 19 people who have been moved to sort of the next level with another round of questioning who to potentially be in that jury pool of 45. So things are happening a little bit differently than usual, but I have to say it seems to be a lot more efficient. Things moved at a pretty quick clip today in the courtroom. Several jurors were dismissed outright because the judge said if they were going to get fired for having to serve on an 8 to 10 week jury, that was understandable and they could immediately be excused. But then there were some excusals for pushback from specifically the defense. They did take issue with a few jurors. One potential juror said that she had seen images of a woman on the floor from a video, which of course we take to mean Cassie Ventura from that now infamous video from the hotel from 2016 of Diddy allegedly attacking her. Now, when she's discussed seeing those images, she said she saw, quote, a damning piece of evidence. And that phrasing really stood out to the defense, that they didn't want someone on the jury who already was looking at a piece of evidence that they will see during this trial as damning to their client. So that juror was dismissed. Another big pushback was the CMO of Simon & Schuster, the chief marketing officer of the publishing company. Simon & Schuster, we learned today, is they're going to put out a memoir in the fall by Albie Shore, another hip-hop artist who shares a child with Kim Porter. That is the late ex of Diddy, who he also has children with. And the book is about Diddy. It's about allegations there. So the defense, once again, really pushing back, taking issue with the fact that there could be potentially a conflict of interest there. So those were the big ones that really stood out today, Elizabeth.
All right, Caitlin Becker, live outside the courthouse. Thanks so much. Let's bring in our panel. Derek Parker is a former New York City Police Department detective, known as the hip-hop cop. He's investigated rap-related crimes in the early 90s and early 2000s. Jesse Weber is a NewsNation legal contributor and Law and Crime Network host. And Robert Hirschhorn is a lawyer and jury and trial consultant. Great to have all three of you here. Jesse, we just, set this up. She set this up perfectly. Several jurors who were questioned today said they have seen this very infamous, frankly, very damning video of Sean Combs beating up Cassie Ventura in this hotel elevator bank area. Hotel security camera is what caught that video. It's aired everywhere by now. How do you pick jurors? I mean, one's already been excused for saying it was damning. I'm not sure how anybody could look at that video and not think it was damning.
Okay, so first of all, let's make it clear. It's actually coming into evidence. There was a back and forth between the defense and prosecution. It's coming into evidence. It's important for the prosecution because they want to say it's not only that she was running away, she was running away from an episode of sex trafficking, that there was a sex worker in that hotel room. The question becomes, well, what is the defense going to argue? They're going to say this was a very unfortunate domestic spat between Combs and an ex-lover. It's not sex trafficking. And I got to tell you, I wonder, as we think about the jurors coming in, is this case too complicated? If I went through what racketeering means and what sex trafficking means, it's very specific. And if the jury looks at this and says, wait a minute, how exactly is this fit into the definition? That's a win for the defense. So right now, it's not a question if they saw the video. Everybody saw that video. It's a question of can they put that to the side and base their decision purely on the facts and the evidence in this case.
Robert, you're a jury consultant. One juror was excused right away when she called, as I said, that video damning. It's hard to see how anybody could watch it and not think the video is damning. And remember, Combs at first denied beating up Cassie Ventura, and then when the video came out, he posted an apology video on Instagram. That apology has now been deleted, but I got to think many of those jurors might have seen it.
Yeah, they have, Elizabeth, but he's charged with trafficking. He's not charged with domestic violence. So whether or not that goes to the actual charges of racketeering and trafficking, that's what the defense has to convey to the jury, that if he was charged with domestic violence, he'd plead guilty. We wouldn't be here. It wouldn't take 8 to 10 weeks. This is about something much bigger. And part of it is swinging is not the same as trafficking. And I think that's what they're going to try to get across to this jury.
Okay, so Robert, jurors were also asked if they or anybody they know have been victims of sexual assault or domestic violence. That seems to be a crucial question here.
You bet. Yeah, so the problem is that there's a lot of victims out there, and a lot of victims have not worked their way through it. If somebody's worked their way through it, they might be actually a pretty good juror because they understand kind of the reality of this situation. But a lot of victims haven't worked their way through the domestic violence, and if any of those get on the jury, it's going to be trouble for Diddy.
Derek, how much of an issue is it that the charge is racketeering, and yet it's just Sean Combs who's being charged? Like, where are all the co-conspirators in this case?
Usually in a racketeering case, you'd have many defendants that would be brought up in front of a federal court. However, in this particular case, it's just him. But see, there's a fine line in this case right now because we have to say, is this sex trafficking that we just discussed, prostitution, or is this these women that have traveled to some of these places that are independent contractors that travel to these parties or want to get to know these celebrities and get involved with them where they want to make it in the industry. So there's another big factor here as well.
You know, to Derek's point, Jesse, there's going to be a lot of pretty graphic, pretty lurid, X-rated testimony in this trial. I know that, you know, the allegation is that Sean Combs not only held these 3-day freak-offs or 4-day freak-offs where people did a lot of drugs, had a lot of sex. Sean Combs videotaped and recorded much of this. People required IV rehydration after these 3-day freak-offs because it was so physically taxing.
1,000 bottles of baby oil, all that. Look, when you read the litigation going into this case, the defense feels very confident. Remember, let me just say this. The fact that we're at trial right now, within less than a year of when he was arrested and indicted.
It's really unbelievably unusual.
He doesn't want to spend another day in prison. They feel confident. They feel so confident that leading up to this case, they felt that the warrants that were used to collect evidence were defective because they said, if the judge who oversaw these warrants actually saw all the videotapes and all the messages, this wouldn't be sex trafficking. This wouldn't be racketeering. And that's a bold statement for the defense to make. Now, as we sit here, we don't know all the digital evidence. The jury's going to see it. Not easy. Have to be ensured that they don't make a decision based on pure emotion, which, again, is easier said than done when particularly right now, after day one, there are some jurors who have experience in sexual assault or harassment and are allowed to move over to the next stage. So it's going to be very interesting to see how they respond to that material.
Derek, this is not the first time Sean Combs has been on trial. He
No.
was on trial. He faced charges when he and his then girlfriend, singer and actress Jennifer Lopez, were involved with charged in a nightclub shooting here in New York City. You were actually on this case.
That's correct.
He was acquitted in that case. Yes. Another man who was with them that night was convicted. That man later said he was the, quote, fall guy for the charges. But the point is that even though there have been many, many years of allegations of violence against Sean Diddy Combs, he has not once been convicted of anything.
No, he has not. He's been involved in several things, but you're right, he has not been convicted.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's because of the facts of the case. There's a lot of people in these industries that don't want to come forward and testify with and get involved in this industry. Also, there's not enough evidence for the police to go on and say, hey, look, we have enough evidence to charge him in these cases. In the case what happened with him at trial with the shooting at New York, right, the nightclub shooting, there was a big problem with that. There were witnesses that gave different variations of what happened.
Right.
So the jury was kind of confused, I believe, and then they voted the way they voted to not acquit him because they couldn't convict him.
Robert, what's the ideal juror in this case? I mean, obviously, he's so famous. He's been famous for a very long time. You're not going to find anybody who's never heard of him. You're probably not going to find anybody who's never heard of this case. Obviously, most people have seen that videotape. What is the defense looking for? What is the prosecution looking for?
Prosecution wants women that have been victims of domestic violence. Prosecution wants liberals. It should not go unnoticed that the entire prosecution team is women. From the defense side, right? I mean, that sends an interesting message.
Yeah.
From the defense side, they want conservative jurors. They want jurors who have worked through domestic violence, or if they've worked through infidelity in their marriage and stayed with it. Those are the kind of jurors that can do compartmentalization. So whether they're male or female, they want jurors that can compartmentalize. And so men are obviously more inclined to lean in Diddy's favor than women. But women are going to be really strong in this case. We'll have women on the jury. There's women that are part of Sean's defense team. But I got to tell you, when we did the William Kennedy Smith case, who was charged with sexual assault, we put predominantly women on that jury, and they acquitted William Kennedy Smith. So the right women might be the best jurors for Diddy Combs.
Finally, very quickly, Jesse, I think obviously witness testimony is going to be crucial here. Cassie Ventura will take the stand. 3 other alleged victims will take the stand. Their testimony is going to be key.
It came out today that one of the alleged victims may not even testify, that they can't get a hold of one of her attorneys, which, if that's the case, and you're now be in the position to force her to testify, that's a problem for the prosecution's case. But yes, it relies mostly on their testimony.
Going back to what Derek just said, lots of people just melt away.
And this trial is going to be watched by everyone. Everyone is really anticipating this trial with Diddy, especially the hip-hop world.
And remember, there were allegations. The reason he's in prison right now, in a jail cell right now awaiting trial, was because the federal government said he was trying to interfere with witnesses, intimidate witnesses into not testifying. I'm curious to hear what...
Well, real quick, you asked the question before, why was he never brought up on charges? The reason that the Cassie episode never happened is because the allegation was he bought up the videotape.
Yeah.
So if the allegation is he always had a way to cover it up, which is what they're saying about racketeering, not only committed the crimes, but covered them up, that's why they're saying it now took all for this time to come.
All right, will be interesting, gentlemen. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. All right, coming up for us, Israel on high alert tonight as war escalates on 2 different fronts. Israel is firing back at Yemen after a Houthi missile hit near Tel Aviv airport. And tens of thousands of reservists are getting notices to report for duty for another push into Gaza. I'll speak live to the former IDF spokesperson all about it. And then later, President Trump wants to reopen the notorious Alcatraz island as a federal prison. But it's not just as simple as turning the lights back on. Remember, it's a museum right now. I'm going to ask an Alcatraz historian who actually lived there for 2 years as a kid.
I want to bring in Leslie. Your mom saw us.
She called me and said, the show I watched, they're coming to Connersville, Indiana.
This is the place that respects all Americans.
Can you go find them?
NewsNation, news for all Americans.
Israel tonight is on high alert on 2 different fronts, launching a massive counterstrike against Houthi targets in Yemen after Houthi rebels launched a ballistic missile at the Israelis' main airport near Tel Aviv. The IDF says it launched at least 20 fighter jets in response, bombing dozens of Houthi targets at the strategic port city of Hodeidah in Yemen. The strike comes a day after the Iran-backed Houthi rebels launched a missile at Tel Aviv's main airport, and that's very unusual and speaks to the enduring offensive capabilities of the Houthi rebels. The alarms at the airport sent passengers scrambling for cover. Now, Israel's defense system tried, but apparently failed to intercept the ballistic missile. Nobody was killed. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made good on his vow immediately after the attack to retaliate. Meanwhile, members of Netanyahu's government announced a major escalation of its Gaza offensive to clear out and crush Hamas. For the first time, we heard that the latest plan could now lead to Israel's total occupation of the Gaza Strip, perhaps indefinitely. Israel's finance minister made those plans clear today.
We are conquering Gaza, clearing it out, and taking control of every area we enter. Finally, after a year and a half that I shout this, in writing, in speeches, on every stage, we are taking control of the humanitarian aid so that it does not become logistical supply for Hamas.
The IDF is already calling up tens of thousands of reservists to help reach that goal. It won't actually happen until after President Trump visits the Middle East next week, allowing time for maybe the possibility of ceasefire negotiations to come up with a deal. For more on all of this, let's go to the former IDF spokesperson and senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Jonathan Conricus. Jonathan, always great to have you on the show. This ballistic missile nearly hit the airport outside Tel Aviv. How did it get through the Iron Dome?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, for having me on. Always a pleasure. What the findings of the investigation by the Israeli Air Force indicate is that it was an interceptor failure. Actually, 2 different types of interceptors failed to intercept it, both the American THAAD and the Israeli long-range missile, which is unusual. And I think it is very dangerous for Israel to have its only international airport bombarded. We can already see that sadly, most international airlines have suspended flights, some of them until the end of this week and some of them indefinitely. That is significant economic damage to the state of Israel, and it really complicates things. And that brings me to, the Israeli response. When we look at what Israel did, and we understand what has been struck in Yemen, it's relatively soft. It is a very limited response. I would say that it's more blowing off steam than really making a meaningful impact on the Houthi military capabilities. And to be honest, I am not sure that anything that Israel is prepared to do when it comes to the Houthis will have a meaningful effect.
What is this, Jonathan? The U.S. has been bombing the Houthis for weeks now. The Israelis just bombed the Houthis. Obviously, you said it was not the most aggressive
Relatively
of efforts.
Limited, yeah.
The point is why is it so difficult to stop this terrorist group, to get this terrorist group?
Well, this group is entrenched in the rural areas and the mountainside of various parts of Yemen. They have almost infinite lines of supply from the Islamic regime of Iran, and they are not burdened too much by the humanitarian situation in Yemen, and they couldn't care about the consequences for the civilian population. So they are a difficult enemy to defeat. They're also motivated by an extreme interpretation of Islam, and if you look at their flag is death to America, death to the Jews, death to Israel, and victory to Islam. That's what they're about. So it's an enemy that is difficult to deal with. And frankly, if Israel wants to defeat them, probably will have to put boots on the ground. And I don't think that Israel is about to launch a 1,200-mile ground invasion against the Houthis.
Yeah.
That is why I think what we're talking about is really bringing it closer to home, and that is bringing it closer to the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're the ones that are equipping the Houthis with missiles. They're the ones who are providing the political directives. That is where the Israeli counterattack should go. Otherwise, we will see reoccurring events of this in the future.
Israel, in the meantime, today approved this plan to capture and occupy the whole of Gaza if no hostage deal happens before May 15th. The plan calls for the IDF to go in and flatten all buildings, move the entire population of 2 million Palestinians to a single, quote, humanitarian area. You must know the international opposition to that will be immense.
Yeah, and that's not accurate as far as I know. I haven't heard any directives given to the IDF to flatten the entire Gaza Strip, and I don't think that's
it's been reported in several places that is what it's called Gideon's Chariots, this plan, and that is what is written in this plan.
No, it isn't. I know that from firsthand from IDF orders. It's one thing what politicians may say. As you know, politicians all around the world, they have a sometimes loose relationship with truth, and that is not the military objective.
That's very diplomatic and probably putting it mildly. So when the politicians are saying we're going to flatten all the buildings, you're saying that is not what the military plan actually reads?
No, that is not the military plan, and that's not a military objective. The military objective is to get the hostages back, and it is to defeat Hamas and to deny Hamas any military or administrative capability in Gaza. Those are the real orders in that order, and I think that is what the IDF will do when it is told. Currently, what we're seeing is creating the capabilities, as you said, enlisting reservists and task forcing them and having them ready to operate. I think we're still a few weeks before that will happen. And Hamas still has time to return the hostages and to prevent that from happening.
And we've got 10 seconds. The families of the hostages are very upset. They released a public statement saying this is a huge mistake. This will put the lives of the remaining hostages at risk.
I fear that to be true, and I think that what Israel is trying to do is to defeat Hamas, sadly knowing that these cruel terrorists will not allow us to get our hostages back. But I believe that allowing Hamas to stay around and to threaten Israelis for the future will endanger lots of other Israelis as well, while I feel the pain of the families.
Jonathan Conricus, appreciate you joining us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
All right, coming up for us, an abundance of caution. That's why we were told all those schools had to stay closed during COVID, long after evidence was beginning to suggest otherwise. Well, now there's a brand new book out with the title that argues that authorities intentionally ignored the evidence and that our kids paid the price. The author of the book joins me live next. It's been five years since COVID shuttered schools, sending tens of millions of kids across America into de facto confinement in their own homes, almost overnight. Educators took lesson plans out of classrooms and put them online. They called it remote learning, and while it was certainly remote, how much learning actually took place is highly debatable. For what seemed like forever, parents wondered when they would be able to send their kids back to school, and anyone who lived through it will recall the answers from public health authorities were very rarely clear-cut. I guess seemed reasonable at the time to some people, maybe to many people. But as the pandemic wore on, evidence began to mount that school closures and masking kids and separating desks by 6 feet wasn't lessening infection or mortality rates compared to European countries, for example, that quickly reopened school doors. Nevertheless, in some areas, schools stayed closed for nearly a year and a half. And according to a new book, we are now seeing the very real effects of that on children in their both learning and their mental health. In the book, An Abundance of Caution, author David Zweig also argues that the decisions made to keep schools closed were based less on actual evidence and more on contrived benchmarks and political tribalism. It's a damning assessment, and David Zweig joins me now. Congratulations on the book. It's extraordinary. Okay, we all remember where we were, March 2020, when the globe, planet Earth, it felt like, shut down. Schools shut down. And 2 months later, in May of 2020, schools in Europe reopened. Nobody did that in the United States. Why the difference?
That's right. The end of April, beginning of May, 22 countries in Europe began reopening their schools. Millions of children. This wasn't a tiny schoolhouse in Tibet in the mountains somewhere with 12 kids. Millions of kids. And this was ignored or dismissed by our public health authorities and largely by the legacy media as somehow bizarrely irrelevant. And that set us on our course where we were basically divorced from what's known as evidence-based medicine or evidence-based public health.
Okay, so weeks go by, months go by, children in Europe aren't dying en masse. Why didn't we then look and say, oh, hold on, we can send our kids back to school in America?
These are really good questions. I spend 450 pages trying to explain how is it that something so manifest, something so harmful and ridiculous when you had evidence existing, empirical evidence in front of us. Unfortunately, a large part of it has to do with tribalism in our country.
Politics.
Politics is a large part. Because of the public health establishment tends to lean in one direction politically, and also our legacy media shares that same political direction. Anything that Trump said was basically radioactive. And
we should just say, too, like, you're not some right-wing crazy guy. You're not.
I approach this topic apolitically. I've written for the New York Times, The Atlantic, New York.
Okay.
I am not a right-wing ideologue by any stretch.
Okay.
This was hard for me to report and hard for me to take in.
Okay, so here's the thing. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a recommendation saying we think schools should open. A few days later, President Trump posts on social media, reopen the schools with, as you put it, many exclamation marks.
Right.
And what does the American Academy of Pediatrics then do?
The Academy reversed its guidance immediately after Trump's tweets. Gone was this idea. They initially very aggressively said, kids need to get in school. They said, don't worry about 6 feet of distancing. If you can't do it, 3 feet is fine. Just get them into school.
They reversed themselves because Trump said, open the schools.
I mean, we can't prove that that's what happened, but people can look at the timeline. There was nothing that changed epidemiologically in that span of time for them to change the rules. It happened immediately after Trump's tweet. And I have lots of other examples beyond the AAP that showed that there was a deep, deep type of tribalism and groupthink amongst these powerful institutions in our country, where we had this kind of manufactured idea of a consensus that didn't really exist in reality.
And in fact, kids were paying a huge price for this. And you go through all the different ways our kids were being hurt by the fact that they were sitting at home, not going into class, barely learning. We have mental health issues. Child abuse actually went up because the people reporting it are teachers, and they were no longer seeing these kids.
That's right. One of the things that's not talked about is, and this was known as early as April of 2020, child abuse cases skyrocketed. The reporting went down because kids rely on teachers and educators as their first line of defense, as someone who spots them that something's wrong. Instead, these kids were left at home with a monster, many of them, and they were harmed because of it. We hear about learning loss, rightfully so, and this has tremendous lifelong effects for kids, but there's so many other things that happen to them that have profound life consequences. Think about a kid who's a poor child in the Bronx who's relying on a football scholarship to get into college. Maybe he's the first one in his family. I spoke to a guy who works with underprivileged youth doing football. What do you think happens to him when that football season is terminated? His life is permanently altered. That doesn't show up in the statistics. And not to mention the smaller things, the canceled senior prom. You don't get to do third grade again, ever.
And the learning loss. Most importantly, the learning loss,
Yes.
which you can't just go back and backfill.
But it's important for me to say, people may be thinking, well, yeah, but they did it to save lives. It's very important for people to understand this saved 0 lives. The evidence was clear before the pandemic. Lots of the academic literature explained why this would be the case, and we certainly saw that within the evidence throughout the pandemic as well.
Okay.
Closing schools did not help anyone. It only harmed kids.
So what about listen, you and I both were talking in the commercial break before this. We remember the fear was palpable then. We did not know a lot about this virus. As parents, we both know I'll send my kid into school and half the class gets sick with a stomach bug. Viruses are like, those classrooms can be petri dishes for viruses. Wasn't it intuitive to think, wait, I can send my kid and 10 kids in the classroom get the stomach bug? Wasn't it also sensible on some level to assume maybe they'll all go to class and 10 will get COVID?
Everything you're saying makes intuitive sense. And for a very brief window in March, it may have helped in some areas to close schools along with everything else. But what we see is that our intuitions are often wrong. And I give a zillion examples of this in the book, particularly with medicine. And what happens is, over a period of time, the implementation science shows us that people don't comply with things that are hard to do. And that includes staying home and staying isolated. Children weren't never going to be isolated once you move past a few weeks, let alone months. And don't forget, a significant portion of our society was always circulating from day one. Schools closing them was never going to be effective. And we saw this with the cellular phone data, which I talk about in my book. You could see people were moving about before they ever even changed the lockdown orders.
And you were getting emails from doctors saying they disagreed with closing the schools. It wasn't based on science, and they were afraid to speak up and say so.
That's right. You know, beyond the AAP example we talked about, after I started writing articles that sort of ran contrary to the establishment view, people around the country started reaching out to me, including physicians at some of our top institutions, including former CDC officials. And they said, thank you so much for writing about this. What's happening to kids is wrong. This isn't based in good evidence. Okay. And nevertheless, they were afraid to speak out, and they were even told by administrators, you are not allowed to contradict Anthony Fauci or the CDC. People had a misunderstanding. They were misled about what the truth was.
Thank you so much. The book is An Abundance of Caution. David Zweig, it's great, disturbing material you've put together in this book, but thank you.
It's a tough read, but necessary.
All right, thank you. Hopefully we'll read and learn. All right, coming up for us, rolling back the clock on the Rock. Alcatraz potentially returning to its glory days as a federal prison. President Trump is pushing to make it happen. Could it actually work? I'll ask someone who lived there as a kid and knows it well. Make Alcatraz a prison again. That's the latest of President Trump's outside-the-box policy proposals. The infamous prison located in the middle of San Francisco Bay once housed the likes of Al Capone and James Whitey Bulger. It gained notoriety for being nearly impossible to escape. Now President Trump has told the Bureau of Prisons he wants the tourists out and the prisoners back in.
It represents something very strong, very powerful in terms of law and order. Our country needs law and order. Alcatraz is, I would say, the ultimate.
Alcatraz was built in the 1930s. It has not housed prisoners since 1963 because of its crumbling infrastructure and high maintenance costs. At the time it was closed, officials estimated it would cost roughly $3 to $5 million to restore the Rock. Additionally, it costs about $44,000 a year to house a single federal prisoner there. And despite the Bureau of Prisons saying Alcatraz was nearly 3 times more expensive to operate than any other federal prison, it says it will pursue all avenues to support and implement President Trump's agenda. There were several infamous escape attempts from Alcatraz. The FBI reports 36 men tried 14 separate escapes. Nearly all of them were caught or didn't survive. But the fate of 3 escaped convicts remains a mystery to this day. Frank Morris and brothers John and Clarence Anglin vanished from their cells on June 12, 1962, never to be seen again. Our next guest lived this escape in real life. Jolene Babiak spent several years as a kid living on Alcatraz while her dad worked on the island as an administrator. She was jolted awake by sirens when those 3 prisoners went missing. Jolene has since written several books. She's written about some of the most well-known prisoners and other families living on the island prison. Jolene Babiak joins me now. Thanks so much for joining us. So Alcatraz was closed because it was too expensive to operate. It was falling apart. Can you imagine it reopening as a prison?
I'm sure the government can do anything it wants, but it is hard to imagine.
What was the condition like? What was it like?
Well, you know, we're 3 miles from the Pacific Ocean, and you're talking about salt sea air.
Yeah.
And concrete has rebar in the middle, right? And so once there's a crack in the concrete, the moisture gets inside, and the salt and it corrodes the building from the inside. So you're talking about infrastructure that is literally always falling apart. And that's true today. This is 62 years later.
It's now a museum. It's a tourist attraction, actually. How would you close down the museum and put up the prison bars again?
Oh, well, the prison bars are still there.
For the tourists.
For the tourists. But yeah, you know, it's also a good educational opportunity as well. Students come out there, and so it's not just a tourist attraction. It's also a really good educational tool for explaining prison and criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And you know, so it has a lot of variety of purposes.
You moved there decades ago with your family. Your dad told you at the time, don't pack everything because we won't be there very long. This place isn't going to last.
Well, that's what some of the officers told him. And I've even seen a memo from 1945 that warned the warden that if they didn't fix the powerhouse, the island was going to close that year. So that was 1945. My dad arrived in 1953, and he was told, don't bring your goods because, you know, the island's going to close. And that was always the rumor that it was going to close for a variety of reasons. The public didn't like it. They sent letters to Congress. Congress didn't want to appropriate money. When you don't appropriate money to a facility, it starts to fall apart.
This has always been unique because it's a prison on this island. Is part of the reason, you know, it's impossible to escape because you can't swim, you know?
No, it's not impossible. It's not impossible. It's cold water. The tides are against you because they're going down to Silicon Valley in the South Bay, or they're going to Hawaii.
Yeah.
And so you're being swept away from land, you know, and we have swims, 5 or 6 swims a year, but it's done during slack tide. So it's really about tides, and then the temperature of the water, and then, you know, the sharks, the illustrious sharks. But more than that, it was the high security of the guard force to the prisoners.
And
I've got
to ask. Oh, sorry, but you were there the night of the infamous escape of the 3 prisoners. Nobody knows whatever happened to them. What do you think happened to them, since you were there that night?
It's important to understand that you didn't come to Alcatraz because of your crimes. You came there because of your behavior, and it was the top of the pyramid. And so by the time you got there, you were a very high-profile, poorly behaved prisoner. And sadly, people take that personality with them when they escape, and they tend to get caught. So the fact that there was no one caught in that instance is not a good sign for them.
You think they drowned?
Probably, yes.
Okay, or the sharks got them. Either way, not the ending they were hoping for when they broke out of their cells.
But you know what? They moved into immortality. I mean, if they'd been found or if they'd drowned, we wouldn't be talking about it today.
No.
But they went missing.
Yep. All right. Jolene Babiak, fascinating to talk to you. What an experience you had growing up as a kid on Alcatraz. Great to see you.
Thank you.
All right. Coming up for us, Chris Cuomo is talking the future of the Democratic Party with the former governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, on his show coming up in just a few minutes. He's also got Trump now endorsed sports commentator Stephen A. Smith. Chris joins me with a preview next. What's it going to take for the Democratic Party to see some wins during the midterms after the major defeat the Democrats suffered in 2024? Well, Chris Cuomo is going to have a discussion last night with two guests who could help shape the future of the party. You're speaking with former Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe. And actually, Stephen A. Smith isn't a Democrat. He's an independent, right?
Yeah, he's not a Democrat.
Yeah.
I think Stephen A. Smith is confused, like the rest of us, in terms of, like, you know, what's going on here and why. But I'll talk to him about it tonight, and specifically about why he's not a Democrat. Terry McAuliffe is an interesting proposition. By all rights, he should absolutely still be part of the brain trust of the Democratic Party, but I'm not sure he is, Elizabeth.
Really? Why
not? And I think
not?
that's a big indication of the problem.
Yeah.
I think it's because there is a misplaced premium in politics on new. And new is not always better. And I think the Democrats are learning that the hard way.
Also, Terry McAuliffe is a voice of common sense, I think, in years past. And there's been a lot of, I don't know. I'll be curious to hear both of your guests tonight, Chris, so take it away.
With all due respect to the Obama folks, I still think Bill Clinton's presidency, in terms of the politics of it, not the personal stuff that he had to deal with, is still the model for how Democrats get the most done in the modern era.
Yeah.
But we'll discuss.
Okay.
Elizabeth, thank you.